Looking good, man.
I don't think we need a microphone. What do you think?
No, we can do it on mic.
So hi, thanks for coming tonight. The purpose of this meeting was to address some simple numbers in terms of determining how well some of the area school systems are doing in terms of diversity. And this all took place, and we became motivated to do this, because in the school committee debate in Watertown last winter, one of the school committee incumbents started to raise the issue of how Watertown had an extraordinary split between what he called the old Watertown and the new Watertown. And what he meant by the old Watertown was the political, officials, but also the school staff. And he cited some numbers and then pointed out the fact that the Watertown schools had a dramatically different population than, the historical Watertown. In fact, 900 out of 2,600 kids are now, what get referred to as minority, but it's a more diverse population. And there was some stunning statistics that he cited. One of them was in comparison to Arlington. Arlington has 360 or so kids who are defined as Hispanic, which quite honestly is kind of inaccurate. It's really Latino or Latin, because of so many Portuguese-speaking kids and whatever. This is Dr. Guardati, actually, who was the person who started the whole debate at the school committee level. But Arlington has 36 Latino or Latina staff members, faculty, for 360 kids. For 392, we have one. Okay, and that was the initial stat. And that is sort of what's reflected across the board. So the suggestion was that we have, if not the worst, one of the worst kinds of things. But it caused a lot of angst because I think incumbent members of the school committee felt that it was casting the town in kind of a negative light. And so the way that it was handled was to take it private, where it could be worked on and whatever. So I was curious as to whether or not the numbers were accurate, okay? Whether there was, in fact, a problem. So really the purpose of this exercise today is to sort of set the table and to establish facts, just to go through. Now in doing so, one of the people that I consulted with was longtime school committee member, NAACP official Richard Harding, and from Cambridge. I'm going to let Dhimitri do the honors of introducing him, but I will note that 3 decades ago, I was district director to Congressman Joe Kennedy, and we had a youth program, and we had a precocious 14-year-old who, when he was assigned to a particular place, decided to create his own placement. So he ended up at Citizens Energy, and basically in one form or another, we've had him ever since. I think that's sort of that, but in any event, I want to introduce David Allen Pierre, and David's going to explain what's on these charts, and we should probably pass some of these around. Yeah. So David Allen Pierre.
Yes. Does everyone have one of these?
Yeah. Everyone else thinks so. Thumbs up, David.
All right. So for this spreadsheet, I'm just gonna explain to you what each area means. So on the left side is the student for each town. The AA stands for African American, and as you go to the right side, it tells you each different backgrounds of the student for each town. And all the way to the right side, it tells you the total of students that each school has. Watertown has about 110 African American students, which I thought was pretty low because I've lived here for about a year, and I've not met that many African American. And I think that number should improve. And as you go to the right side, you get into the faculty numbers, and it tells you the amount of faculty that they have in every single background. such as African American, Asian, Hispanic, multi, and whites. And as you move towards the right, tell you the students, the teachers and staff ratio. Keep in mind that the number of staff doesn't necessarily mean the number of teachers that teach, because they have staffs at the school that don't teach. So in Watertown, you have 45% of the teachers of the staff that actually teach. And as you move towards the right, it tells you the MCAS rank out of 356, which Watertown is ranked 264th out of. And as you keep on going to the right, it tells you the income of each town, which is ranked from 351. And then the last one, it tells you how much each town spent on each student, which Watertown spent about $20,720.
Dhimitri Dorceus.
All right, good afternoon. My name's Dhimitri Dorceus. I'm a recent, well, not so recent, but I graduated Watertown High School in 2015, and I'm currently going to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and studying civil engineering. So right now, I would like to introduce our guest speaker for tonight, Richard Harding, Vice President of Cambridge and NAACP.
That's it? Getting 3 pages.
Richard has served 16 years on the Cambridge School Committee, current Director of Men of Color Health Initiative and Program Consultant to the Job Training Program in Cambridge Works.
Thank you, I was just kidding. Let's give him a round of applause right there. So thank you for having me, both Dimitri and Paul. You know, I know Paul a long time. He kind of told you my age. I try to stay young in my days. But yeah, I met Paul a long time ago when I was a kid at Cambridge in Latin, and I was looking for a summer internship. And we've been friends ever since. And I want to thank him for bringing me here, mainly because this is an issue that I'm passionate about. I think that when you get into politics, you come into it for different reasons. Many different motivations motivate people to run for office. And my motivation was to make sure that we had in Cambridge an equitable school system, you know, one that treated everybody equally and one that educated all children, because that's what I believe a good school system should really do. And you talk about Watertown, you know, spending $20,000 per pupil. You know, we in Cambridge spend closer to $30,000 per pupil with a very, very small student population. And so for me, my motivation was just to make sure that our schools work for all kids, no matter what zip code they lived in the city, and that any kid, whether they live in East Cambridge or West Cambridge, North Cambridge, or in other areas, they all were going to be able to find success in the public school system. So I just want to thank you for having me, and I want to jump in and talk a little bit about the issue that Paul outlined, which is diversity in the public schools, particularly in Cambridge, because that's my experience. But I think that some of what I'll talk about will translate into some of the Watertown problems. So I have a little, welcome, David Quilter, the famous David Quilter. So I'm going to talk a little bit about diversity in Cambridge and then sort of open it up so we can have a conversation with you. I just want to start by saying that the biggest issue that I think school districts find with the issue of diversity is, does it really matter, right? That's the big question, because in some places it becomes a zero-sum game, right? There's always this irrepressible conflict of, will diversity hurt my kids? So the status quo generally works for the people who are in power in the political system there. In Cambridge, we're a very affluent town, as you know, one of the richest towns in the Commonwealth for sure. But there is a kind of parochial argument about whether or not diversity will hurt different groups of kids. If you're affluent and you maybe are white and you're college educated, how does that work with kids who are like me, who grew up in public housing, maybe the first to go to college? And I think that conflict is what causes the sort of tepid approach to the change in the schools. So what we did in Cambridge was to first reaffirm our values to diversity, right? So a lot of times in progressive places, and I found this throughout the country, but particularly in Cambridge, we're more progressive, we talk more progressive than we actually are in action, right? So it's the same old thing, you know, I love diversity, but just not next to my kid, or I want, you know, more diversity in my neighborhood, but just don't buy a house in my neighborhood, or, you know, I like that kid, but just don't take my daughter to the prom. I mean, it goes that deep, right? And so when you're having these conversations, you have to accept that this is gonna, you know, that race and racism and class, these things will, I would say, infect the conversation in a way. One of the things that I think, you know, you're the school committee member who actually, did you serve in the school committee here?
Yes, I did.
Okay. So I thank you, because I think that part of what we have to do is understand that our government will only be as good as we ask it to be, right? That's what it is. And we have to make sure that we hold accountable sort of the people that serve to serve the people's will. And so I appreciate the fact, and Paul told me a little bit about your story, that you went out on a limb in some ways, and it may have cost you politically, and this is what courage looks like, quite frankly. So I just want to thank you for that. And Paul told me about it. I could see how it happened. You know, you brought up the issue. Privately, everybody probably said, you're right, you're right, you're right, but publicly they probably treated you quite differently. And so part of this is to make sure that you have the political will of your city and community behind you to understand that diversity matters and why it's good. So what we did in Cambridge was first set up the framework for why diversity mattered. So in Cambridge, even though we have an embarrassment of riches, there's a serious academic achievement gap between kids of color and other groups. And at this moment, the gap is even different than what's defined. Usually the achievement gap is defined by African American or minority students and white students. In Cambridge, what's interesting, and Asian students are students of color, but the Asian students outpace most of the kids in Cambridge. And so that was a new wrinkle in the debate. So I was on the floor of the school committee. My daughter's an African American female. At the time, she scored high advance on both sides of the MCAS. So in some ways, she was an anomaly to all of the data. But the truth was, as I was advocating for other kids, I had to say, if there's an achievement gap at 31% proficiency and 51% between African Americans and white kids, but the Asian kids are at 70%, why are we talking about the white and the black kids when actually we all should be trying to chase the Asian kids' performance? And so what I forced them to do was look at proficiency as the standard. No longer should you really look at where different kids are, but you have to look at a standard in which kids can meet that and be competent. And a lot of times people were, you know, conflicted by this. They were saying, well, it's too MCAS heavy and it's, you know, too much, you know, tailoring to the test. But the truth is, in our good schools in Cambridge, that didn't matter. When the curriculum was strong, when the instruction was rigorous and the communication between the teacher and student was good, we saw success globally across the board. So we had to set the framework, and one of our frameworks was that we understood that kids of color were doing much worse across the board, boys and girls, than other kids in the district. So one, student achievement. That was the basis of the conversation. The second piece was that we understood that you can't just talk about this and make it happen overnight. These are really hard conversations. You have to really challenge the status quo in a way that hasn't been challenged. You have to challenge teachers, you have to challenge administrators, you have to challenge principals, and you have to challenge your neighbors to understand that diversity matters. And so what we did as a school committee was we went out on a limb with an audacious goal to have 30% of our teaching staff of color to prove and reaffirm our commitment to diversity. Now, where we messed up in Cambridge was here. So as we're working to this 30%, we, over time, never really even reached it, right? Actually, excuse me, it was 20%. We never reached the 20%, but then we reaffirmed, just because we had spent so many resources in trying to set up a culturally competent workforce, looking at our HR and affirmative action practices, talking to our community members, which included student voices, which was very important. We actually, without ever getting to 20 at the time, we moved the goal line to 30%. Because we thought that we had the resources to be able to do that. And right now I think Cambridge sits at about 22%. So we actually hit the old goal but not the new goal. And this is where success in some ways is helpful, but the truth is, if anybody were running for office right now for school committee in Cambridge, you could consistently say that Cambridge hasn't reached its diversity goals. Cambridge, I believe, is the second or third most diverse school district. We're a small school district after Boston. But the truth is, you can go to Cambridge and Gelatin and never once see an African American or teacher of color. So even though we're diverse in some ways and we look diverse, we're not actually as diverse as we need to be. We had for a long time held an office of affirmative action. We realized through an assessment that that office wasn't as effective as it ought to be. We understood that two things were critically important to make this work, and they weren't happening in Cambridge. One was the affirmative action office in an ideal situation, and the HR office would be hand in hand working towards all of the things that are necessary to recruit and retain teachers of color. That's hiring, that's finding the talent, that's making sure they're supported when they're in the district. So there was a clear disconnect. So we decided to reorganize that particular office and function to make sure that it was more aligned with HR. The other thing we did was we really looked at what was some of the root causes of why we weren't getting to where we wanted to get to. There are all these other factors, some of which, quite frankly, I don't believe in all of them, but the truth is that we, through an assessment, found out that these things were true. One was that Cambridge was a very unaffordable place. The old school thinking was that you could go down to some of the HBCUs and just recruit talent and bring them up. We paid pretty well. They would love to get their first job in a city like Cambridge because we have all the other universities and all the other culture that is necessary to attract people. But the truth is, it's a very unaffordable place. You cannot come from the middle of Alabama and think you're going to live on a teacher's salary in Cambridge. It's just not going to happen. So that was one thing. The second piece was that we looked at some of the other data that showed that many students of color coming out of the universities and colleges were struggling with the MTEL. Because we are a school district and not a charter district, that's a requirement. You have to pass the teacher certification test. We didn't have a lot of people that were passing that at the clip that was necessary to maintain a diverse school system. We also looked at how our fiefdoms were in our schools and how the teachers and administrators in the schools were actually chosen. So oftentimes in Cambridge, teachers are chosen through school-based committees. So if we all look alike and we are the committee, it's a natural thing that 8 out of 10 times you're going to hire someone that you're comfortable with through your school community. So we realized that that was a problem. We need to find a better way to do that. We also wanted to make sure that we had the cooperation of the CEA, and I think this is big. I'm not sure if Watertown has who they use or what union they're in. They might be in another union, but our Cambridge Educational MTA. So we have a local union that reports to the MTA, but we sat down with our local union president and said, look, this matters to us, it should matter to you, how do we make this happen? And then lastly, but probably most importantly, our student voices, and I'll have Paul send you a recent piece of media that our students did. It's called the Minority Report. You can look at it on YouTube. But our student voices, particularly the student school committee members, most of whom were going to, Harvard and other top flight schools, often white, but some, black, were consistently speaking about their school experience, whether it be in AP classes, whether it be how they could play soccer or basketball with the kid here, but they could go to their classes and not see any diversity in their classes. They really spoke up loud and really forced us to have a different conversation about it. I remember there was a student school committee rep who was also in the student government. I don't know if he was the president or not, and he spoke eloquently about how he felt himself being a kid, in his own words, of privilege, but not being able to share that experience with the kids who he was socializing with on the fields or in his classes. And so it forced us to come to the table and really think about and take diversity seriously. So when you come to these conversations about does diversity matter, and I said this to Paul earlier, I look at it from the perspective and lens as a father. So my daughter, who, as I said, is pretty bright, I often say she hit the genetic lottery, but the truth is that she's a really, really good student and she studies hard and she is talented. But in her case, I thought about what her experience would be post-CRLS. And so I wanted her to be able to live in a world where she's going to have to deal with the everyday struggles of everyday life, deal with people of all colors and creeds, and be able to manage that in a way where she felt comfortable, confident in her abilities. And so I have a black daughter, but I wanted her to be able to deal with white teachers and Asian teachers and black teachers and teachers of all persuasions, because that's what the real world is about. And so we look at it in Cambridge as a social justice issue, we look at it as an issue of equity, and we look at it as an issue of fairness. And also, as I said in the opening statement, as the representative of the city, as a school committee member, our students and community were speaking to the fact that they wanted this. So one of the things that we had to do was think about the ineffective leadership in the Affirmative Action Office. And so we, as we say in Cambridge, we don't fire people, we move them along, but we moved the person along who had been there for a while and she was very ineffective, and brought in a new person who was just hired about a year ago to really look at this particular issue with some seriousness and make sure that we were on track. We figured that we had to do this at the policy level. If you don't know, in Cambridge, similar to many other districts, the school committee sets the policy and sets the budget, priorities, basically spend the money and set the policies for the school district. But we had to, from a policy, from the level 30,000 feet above everyone else, we had to really be intentional about how we went about this. And so some of the things we did very quickly where we created an achievement gap subcommittee, which talked about achievement gap and cultural competency and issues of race and class. We hired this new manager for diversity who has come in. He's a Hispanic gentleman, but he's come in hitting the ground running. We looked at the data, right, and we realized that the student experience in the classroom should mirror life experience, and we needed to make sure that we were preparing kids for the world and making sure that we also understood that Cambridge was a changing place, right? Cambridge was a place that now we have a lot of, West and East Africans, we have a lot more Asian students, we have a lot of students who, for whatever reason, have fallen into poverty. Half of the Cambridge Public Schools students, and this is probably data from 2 years ago, but half of the students in the Cambridge Public Schools live in low-income or subsidized housing, right? So you have a real issue of the haves and have-nots, right? In the most, the most successful city and richest city, probably in the 351 cities and towns in the Commonwealth. But half of our school population lives in public housing or on some public subsidy. So we had to think about that. You're talking about, half the district that, for whatever reason, didn't have an experience that had professionals that looked like them in the classroom. One other thing I'd state is that there was a group of teachers who, and you probably could read this in the paper, who fiercely came to school committee and other places and really talked about how they were treated and how they felt like they weren't supported. This was a big deal for us because, as you know, as politicians, bad press is never good, but when the bad press is true, it's even worse. And in Cambridge, that was our reality, that we knew that we weren't prepared as a system to be able to support teachers or students of color. And so that forced another level of conversation around this particular issue. I just wanted to talk about just a little bit, some of what our data has shown to be true. So in Cambridge, I don't know if you know this, but about 6 years ago, we changed from a K-8 system to a middle school system. And one of the things that the superintendent was he in Newton, Jeff Young, was he in Newton or Watertown? So he was a superintendent from Newton that we had hired in Cambridge. He's now working at Columbia University in the Teachers College. He's moved along. But we knew that we needed to make a strong statement around diversity. So we basically created 5 new schools. And in these 5 new schools, 4 of the headmasters of the upper schools were people of color. And everybody was like, wow, this had never happened in a city where you literally gave an opportunity for professionals of color, educators of color to lead a school. And it came with a lot of flack, I have to tell you. I mean, people, I've never seen people get so nasty until it became issues of race and class as it pertained to their kids' classroom experience. And you heard people say things like, I don't want my kids with those kids, how could you do this to us, we're gonna leave. What we had to do in Cambridge is understand this, that half of our school population had no choice. We had to create a school system that was equitable and that worked for them because they couldn't go to BB&M, they couldn't go to any of the private schools. And we had to stand firm on our values and make sure that our integrity was intact as we pushed this forward. And after time, and I mean time, a couple of years, I think the community rallied around us. So one of the things we looked at was implementing a dynamic diversity development initiative, which really renewed our commitment to sustaining a workplace and learning environment that was welcoming, accepting, and free of discrimination. We also had to think about how we were going to change people's attitudes around diversity and really, with the data, prove to them that while it looked like we were doing well, we really weren't doing well. And so what we did was really have a community conversation that started with the school committee and the students, but then encompassed the whole community around what we liked and what we thought diversity should look like. We looked at many different models of schools where you had kids who were minorities, minorities from any persuasion, low income, often first in their, no one in their family went to college, and we saw that in some clips, 90% of them were able to score proficiency on whatever state test it was. There were schools in New York, schools all around the country. And so that was one thing that proved that this could happen, that color was not a barrier to success. The other thing was to really get the teachers to talk about their experiences and talk about their biases and microaggressions in a way that was non-judgmental. And so we had teachers who, and quite frankly in some of these sessions, really broke down and cried because they did not want to seem like they didn't want to teach the kids that were of color, but they just didn't really have the tools, in their opinion, to know how to do it. And then lastly, it was really having the students have us better understand what it was like a day in the life of a student at Cambridge Regional Latin. So when we took all those things together, we decided that we needed to talk about some solutions. And, you know, this was a conversation that was hard. I have to say this, whenever you bring up race in class, I don't care where I've been, there are always hard conversations because people have biases. We have to understand that. And oftentimes when they share those biases, they feel like everybody in the room is looking at them. And it's really, really hard for them to be honest because they don't know what's going to happen after that 3-hour professional development thing. You know, Paul said, you know, I really was uncomfortable around Creole-speaking kids, and he was a teacher in a school. He thinks, in a lot of teachers' mind, that people are just going to hold that against them. The truth is, honestly speaking about this openly in a place where it's non-judgmental helps to move the conversation along. And so what I'd say to you in Watertown is that the first part of this, in any solution, is to have the conversation, right? You cannot continue in this, I'm not talking to you personally, but you know, collectively we cannot continue to not have the conversation and expect to have a different result. You know, the heartbeat of racism is denial. So if you're denying the problem, you're never going to get to where you need to be. I also think that for Watertown and other places, you have to have the institutional prerogative. You have to want to be diverse. You have to want it. You can't just assume it's going to happen, right? When I was talking to Paul, you know, he talked about the Watertown experience, and this is true, that most places only become diverse when the student population forces them to, right? Usually it's a linguistic thing, right? Usually it's the language thing. It's not really counting how many kids look like me, Dhimitri and us guys up here. It's really about the language. The teachers can't communicate in a way because different populations come in, so it forces the system to adapt. That's not the reason to be diverse. You should be diverse because you want to have your students, no matter what color or persuasion they are, have a worldly view of what's going to happen when they step out of the doors and step across the bridge from Watertown or from Cambridge or from anywhere else. Diversity is something that you have to value. We in Cambridge look at it as a social justice issue, as I said, and so we look at it as just something that we should do. It's the right thing to do. The other thing that has to happen really is you have to think about if you're going to make the investment in a culturally rich and socially just and equitable school system. This is an investment, right? You have to invest in the cultural competency to make sure your teachers are understanding and have the tools, and these are for black teachers and white teachers. Cultural competency is for everyone, right? Everybody has to understand what it is to operate in an atmosphere where people are different, right? Different attitudes, different cultures. There's reasons why different things happen, and people have to be very understanding of that. The other piece is that oftentimes in Cambridge, the teachers are a solid block, right? So the teachers stick together. They don't care what the issue is, they're sticking together. And so you have to make sure that there's no infighting around this issue, that they are together as one, thinking about diversity and thinking about their children every day. I think about when Cambridge was kind of at a crossroads, particularly around the desegregation of our schools. So in Boston, it was a lot more, you know, on the newspaper, it was a lot more fiery, and they were throwing rocks at the bus. Cambridge did it a little more quietly. We took some schools in Cambridge, and this is in and around 1984-5, that were 90% black on one end, 90% white on the other. And I look at the Roberts School, which is in the Port area, and the Robert F. Kennedy, which is in East Cambridge. And we were forced to, or there was a decree that said, listen, you know, you guys are gonna have to do something or we're gonna come in. And this was to the point of the bad press. And Cambridge had a system in which they integrated the schools. They took one school, it went from K through 4. The kids from the east side of Cambridge came over. The other school, in my neighborhood, the older kids went there. And while there was a little bit of a tumultuous time, you know, maybe like a year or so, things actually worked out pretty good. And so that was the beginning of Cambridge really looking at diversity in a real way. I won't say that, and this is a change from neighborhood schools to school choice citywide. So when I talked to Paul about Watertown, I mean, one of the things that was very frustrating to him was that Watertown was afraid to have the conversation. And so I think to start the conversation, it should start this way. One, you have to have the students understand what we're talking about, right, around diversity and why it's important for them. Take that voice, obviously, back to their parents so that you have a community conversation about this. When that catches fire, I think that's when you engage in a real way the politicians who will probably resist this unless it's sexy, or resist it if there's not enough of a constituent base, right, to really support the notion of real change. Transformative change that comes from the people, for the people, has to have a backing. And so oftentimes, and we talk about my colleague here was in the school committee, you will have someone who will have to suffer the consequence of a conversation around diversity, particularly in a town like Watertown. And so when that happens, you have to organize and really just show the proof in the pudding. I think when Paul just stood up and said that out of all the kids, the diversity they have in the school, they have one person of color. Is that person a teacher?
One Hispanic, 2 people of color, though one is leaving the system.
One is leaving. So that's a compelling argument enough. And also just thinking about how from a policy perspective, you're moving in that direction. I think that for me, I'm on the school committee, because Cambridge is progressive, I think that while there was a lot of apprehension, I think that the difference was in Cambridge, if you had someone who was sounding the alarm like me, my colleagues had to move because they didn't want a progressive place look like they were standing in the way of progress. But I'd have to tell you that for many of those folks, when their kids were in these schools that were preserving diversity, this was a tough time for them. There was one of my colleagues who actually lost an election similar to you, because in her particular school, this school was the Grand Parks, one of the most popular schools in the city. She was seen, because she voted for this new middle school thing, which was going to make the schools more diverse. She was seen as ruining their school, is what they said, and so she lost in a close election. And she became our you, quite frankly. She became the litmus test for how we were going to, in Cambridge, really embrace or not this particular transformative change. Let me get to some of the things that I think might work in Watertown that I've tried to do in Cambridge, and some of the things that I think you could probably do in Watertown if you want to help change the game for yourself. So one of the things is, you know, in Cambridge, when we were good at this, one of the things that we did, and I'll give you just a couple of strategies.